Good morning, everyone. My name is Anna Olsson. As a long-time UFAW member, it is my tremendous pleasure to welcome all of you to the place where I work and to be able to participate as a local organizers of a UFAW Congress. In full transparency, I would like to make clear that everything that goes well during these 2 days is thanks to UFAW and to my colleague, Paulo Vaz Pires, who's over there. Everything that goes wrong is probably due to me not being sufficiently involved, and I'm happy to take the blame. The only thing I don't take the blame for is the weather, but it is supposed to clear up in the afternoon, so let's hope for that. I would like to invite my colleague, Manuel Villanova, who is the Vice Director of this faculty, to give the official welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Dear Professor Hugh Golledge, dear colleagues Anna Olsson and Paulo Vaz Pires, dear members of the organizing committee, dear speakers, dear participants, it is my privilege to welcome you at ICWAS for the UFAW International Animal Welfare Conference 2024. And we are really delighted to host this important event where a diverse range of professionals gather to discuss animal welfare and science from a broad perspective. At ICWAS, we embrace transdisciplinary approach to science. Our institution provides fertile ground for researchers in animal, human, and environmental health to work together under one health perspective and under the motto, one school, one health. So hosting this conference, where so many issues related to animal welfare will be discussed, it is very much in line with the ICWA's mission. And I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the work that Anna is promoting in education and knowledge on animal welfare at this institute. The contemporary challenges faced by animal welfare can only be successfully addressed by comprehensive and integrated approaches, and the present UFAW conference is an outstanding example in this regard. The conference program that I've been looking at is particularly appealing. It's quite rich and diverse, having contributions that range from basic and applied science to ethics, education, and policy making, among many others. So I would like to commend the organizers for assembling such an interesting meeting. I just wish these 2 days to be most successful for all the conference attendants, and I'm sure that the privileged opportunities for networking and collaboration provided by this event will effectively translate into real progress in the area. So welcome and thank you very much for being here at ICWAS. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would just like to reiterate a welcome to Porto to over 250 delegates joining us either in person or online. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces and old friends and meet some new ones. And I'm sorry at the outset for bringing the British weather with me. That wasn't the intention. We were trying to get away from it, but hopefully it'll improve soon. Thank you at the outset of this meeting to our generous hosts who've made this meeting possible here in Portugal, and particularly our local UFAW links, Anna and Paulo, who's up at the back there, who have worked tirelessly to make sure this meeting is a success. Thank you also to our conference sponsor, Charles River, who've provided support to make this meeting possible. Sadly, I have to do a few of the boring bits as well before we get onto the interesting science. So a few practicalities. If there's a fire alarm, assemble next to the north gate where you came in, follow the fire exit signs. For catering, we'll be doing tea, coffee and lunch outside where the posters are and in the room opposite, and hopefully outside on the terrace as long as it's not raining. If you had special dietary requirements, please just speak to the catering staff and they'll have prepared the food that you need. And we'd also like to invite you to our drinks reception after the close of the sessions today, which again should be outside if it's not raining. That's the map, which you've also got, I think, on your badges if you unfold them, just to show you where everything is. This is the Wi-Fi. If you need to use the Wi-Fi, connect to that network, and the username and passwords are UFAW 2024. So it's the UFAW Porto network. Hopefully that will work. Once you're connected, please do follow us on social media. It's hashtag UFAW 2024, and on Twitter or X or whatever it's called this week, it's at UFAW_1926 if you want to follow us. Just to warn you, we will be taking photos and videos. And if you need an attendance certificate, you can pick one up from the desk outside. We've got 2 poster sessions. So today we'll be doing posters with people whose surname starts from A to J and K to Z tomorrow. Or for those of you online, you can access them in the link that we shared with you. Tomorrow afternoon, you have the choice of attending a workshop on animal welfare as a profession outside of academia or beyond academia, where you can hear from me and much more interesting people about their work in animal welfare science outside of academia, which might be of particular interest to our early career researchers who are joining us. That's just for people in person. That bit won't be streamed. Or you can stay here in this room for the final set of talks. So the workshop will be in monoblock 2, which you can see on your map, and it's downstairs and slightly across the campus, but we'll get you some better directions tomorrow. And then if everyone could reconvene for the final session in this theatre, where we'll close and give our poster prizes and so on before we close the meeting formally tomorrow. The other bit that I'm going to sneak in before we get onto the science that you all came to hear about is just to tell you a little bit about UFAW for those of you who don't know us quite as well as some of you do. So UFAW is an international scientific and educational charity focused entirely on animal welfare. And we like to express our mission with these 3 Ds, with apologies to the 3 Rs, that we try to discover what matters to animals, develop scientific evidence-based solutions to animal welfare problems, and disseminate that evidence so that it actually gets put into practice, which hopefully is what we're doing today. And we do that through all sorts of schemes and activities, but I just wanted to highlight a couple today. First of all, we do support research. We do fund grants, depending on how much money we have. You are very welcome to apply to us for funding, particularly for smaller projects. We're particularly proud of doing a lot of student scholarships where undergraduates get their first exposure to doing animal welfare research. And we've also recently launched a mentoring scheme to support those undergrads doing their first bit of research. And I'll come back to that in a second. But do have a look at those links if you need funding. We also publish the longest continuously published animal welfare journal, funnily enough called Animal Welfare, which recently went gold open access, so anyone can read anything we publish. And we also offer really extensive waivers for article processing charges. So anyone in a country in the global south will get an automatic waiver, and authors anywhere who struggle to pay from grant funds or from their university's funds, we will look at giving a waiver to make sure that there's no financial barrier to publishing in animal welfare. So again, do consider publishing in animal welfare. The editorial team are all here pretty much today, and we'll be out. We've got a little poster and a table out there. You can come and talk to us with any questions about publishing. So most importantly, Steve Weddell, who's the managing editor who steers all your papers through publication, is here, and my joint editor-in-chief, Beata, who does far more of the work than I do, is also here. So come and talk to them. And in fact, we've also got our publisher, Katie from Cambridge University Press, who's here somewhere. Yep, out the back there. So you can come and talk to all of us about publishing in animal welfare. As you heard, we have links, as we like to call them, people in universities where the university is very active in animal welfare research, who represent UFAW and represent animal welfare, like Anna and Paolo here in Porto. We've got 157 of those in 50 countries. But if you happen to be at an institution that isn't already linked to us, please do consider applying. You can talk to Steve, who's here today, or follow those links to learn more about that scheme and how we can support animal welfare in your institution. I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about the mentoring scheme that we launched recently, where we provide a matching. So our mentoring scheme matches early career researchers, typically postdocs, with undergraduate students who are applying for funding, typically to do their first piece of animal welfare research. And what it tries to do is provide support for those students who really want to do some animal welfare research, but maybe just don't have the network or the support in their local institution to really put together a good application, or need some support whilst they're doing the project. And this has turned out to be a really great scheme, not just for the students that we mentor, but also for the people who do the mentoring, who get their first chance probably to supervise a student. So what I'm going to do is, instead of me telling you lots about that scheme, folks back at the office have made a really nice set of video interviews between mentors and mentees where they explain what the scheme did for them. And we've distilled that into a little 1.5 minute social media video, which I'm going to play to you if you don't mind, and hopefully you won't be deafened.
I think the best thing about the scheme is that you're bringing together people who have the same goal.
It's just a chance to learn and grow.
This experience is super cool for your career, and yeah, you can just open up your horizon and to see more about animal welfare research in an international context.
I think it's great to enlarge the scientific network.
I got more inspired, actually, more to do animal science and welfare.
It was really a great experience.
Very rewarding.
It's an opportunity for growth.
Networking, diversification as well.
Enriching,
Exchange,
engaging,
motivating.
Excellent learning experience.
so fun,
just
fun.
I would just say go for it.
Go for it.
And it's been a wonderful experience.
Go and discover and experience. It's really great.
So I hope that's inspired some of you to consider becoming maybe mentors or being mentored. I think it's a really great scheme and something that we'd really like to grow in future. If you do want to take part, follow that link. You can talk to Liz back at our office, who puts an awful lot of effort into matching the right people together who can really support each other. And I think it's really worthwhile. Having said all of that about the excellent stuff we do, it would be remiss of me to not remind you that we are actually a charity, and the only way we can do any of this is if people support us. So please do consider supporting us. If you're not already a member of UFAW, we would really love you to join. And if you wanted to donate to support our work, that would be fantastic as well. Just follow that link. Or if you're interested in becoming a member of UFAW, you can talk to any of our staff who've got a blue circle on their badges, or one of those things that says, ask me about our membership. And particularly you can visit Ailey, our fundraising manager, who'll be out at the desk in the poster hall and can tell you all about membership or sign you up here and now if you want to join. I'm sorry to tell you though, she didn't bring the dog today, but she will still sign you up. And finally, if you want to stay in touch, just follow that link and you can sign up for our newsletters or follow us on Twitter. So with that, we can move on to the actual business of the day, I'm sure you'll be glad to know, which is to talk about animal welfare science. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Professor Claire Palmer as our keynote speaker for the first talk of the day. Claire's written or co-authored, edited 2 of the books in the UFAW series on ethics of our interactions with animals, including the most recent one on the welfare of wild animals. And today she's going to be talking about what is wild animal welfare like why should we care about it? So, Claire, welcome. That's why we fight for technology. I need to. Is that sharing? Share screen is. Share screen. Sorry, it's in Portuguese. So this one, that one. Is that share screen? Yeah. And then let's show.
I always love it when you come up to the front and find you've got the same shirt on as you had in the photo. So it's great to be here. And I just wanted to start by thanking all the organizers of this conference. I'm sure it's been really complicated and difficult to organize. So I'm sure everyone really appreciates that. So it's kind of intimidating to be here because I'm an animal ethicist. I'm a philosopher. I'm not an animal welfare scientist. Oops, my slides want to move on without me. Okay, let's see if I, but actually I'm hoping that this talk is going to be of interest to animal welfare scientists, and in particular in thinking about wild animal welfare, which is really what I'm going to talk about. So I'm a bit of a roamer, but I'm going to try to attach myself to this microphone and not wander around. But if you can't hear me, shout out if I move too far away. Okay, so why this talk? Well, animal welfare scientists have, as I understand it, mostly focused on the welfare of animals under human care. So domesticated animals, zoo animals, companion animals, and so on. Otherwise, it keeps moving on. But beyond the animal welfare science, and actually also in some parts of animal welfare science, there's been an increasing interest in wild animal welfare. And especially in wild animal welfare problems that are naturally occurring, so ones that are not being caused by human beings. And I started off with a whole bunch of examples of this, but in interests of time, I just picked on one thing to talk about. So the example of mutualism here. So this idea about what's called wildlife mutualism comes from a group of researchers at Colorado State University who are looking at something called wildlife value orientations. And they've been surveying initially in the States, and then they moved out and started surveying more broadly internationally to see what people's attitudes towards wildlife was. And they found that there'd been a shift from what they called kind of using animals and seeing wild animals as useful resources to seeing them as being, so this is taken from their website, humans and wildlife live side by side without fear, all living things part of one big family, no animal suffering, that's something we're going to come back to, animals should have rights like humans, we should take care of wildlife, and so on. So this much more kind of engaged view of wildlife as having welfare that people should be concerned about and should potentially intervene in. And these concerns, I think, are going to become increasingly pressing for animal welfare science. So not just concerns about things that people are doing to wild animals, but things that are happening to wild animals independently of humans. But then that raises questions about, well, what should animal welfare scientists think about wild animal welfare? If animal welfare turns out to be bad in nature, is that something that that animal welfare scientists should be intervening into? Or is it something that's basically none of our business, what happens in nature independently of humans? So those are some of the questions that have been tackled currently being tackled in animal ethics, and something that I thought might be interesting for you to hear about. So I'm going to very briefly say something about what I think we can say about wild animal welfare. Then I want to talk a bit more about the discussion that there has been about what the lives of wild animals are actually like. So this is a very contentious area. And then I'll look at some of the views that ethicists have have recently put forward about what we should do about wild animal welfare. And that is also a very contentious area. So there's two big areas of contention here. Then I'm going to say something about the way forward that I think might be a good way of going, which I'm going to call a pluralist approach. And then I'll, if I have time, very briefly look at one particular example that's been put forward of intervention, which is potentially feeding starving polar bears. And then I'll briefly conclude. Okay, so that's my plan. And hopefully this is going to come up red. Yes. Okay. All right. So this is the slide. So this is the slide about wild animal welfare, which I'm not where I feel like, well, I'm, you know, as much. I don't know how many of you know this British expression, but I don't want to teach my grandmother to suck eggs. Actually, come to think of it, that sounds like it's got some animal welfare implications. So forget that. But you know, you're the experts on animal welfare. So in order to think about animal welfare here, I'm just going to go for the kind of dominant interpretation in the literature of seeing welfare as being about animals' subjective experience. So I know there's lots of debate about different models of animal welfare, but thinking about welfare as being animals' suffering, animals' pleasure, basically their subjective experience. So you'd cash out things like health and natural behavior in terms of how animals experience the world. And that's going to be true, that model has been used in domesticated animals, but that's broadly going to be true for wild animals as well. But wild animals, and here I'm thinking about wild living wild animals. So not what, so, and I haven't put wild living all the way through in this because I have enough tendency to be wordy on my slides as it is without sticking wild living in all the time. So when I say wild animal welfare, I don't mean the ones in zoos, I'm thinking about the wild living ones. So they face different kinds of challenges from animals that are under human care, right? Then they're not bred by humans, they're not usually dependent on people. So they have different opportunities in terms of welfare and different challenges. And so some of the literature that I know of in this area has been arguing that wild animals who live wild have opportunities that domesticated animals often don't have to make choices about their own lives, you know, to go where they want to go, to eat the things they want to eat. They're able to express more agency or autonomy, as it's sometimes put. But they also face many challenges, and that those challenges may limit their ability to express their agency because there might be low resources, for instance, in a hard winter. They're threatened by predators. There's extreme weather, as we all know, parasitic infections, pressures from humans, all those kinds of things that might make it difficult for wild animals to be able to express their agency, as it were. And that actually takes me on to the next thing, the main thing I want to talk about, which is what are the lives of wild animals like? So now I'm going to sort of talk about what I see as one of the big contentious areas here. So there's basically been this kind of bifurcation of views about how we should think about the lives of wild animals. So on the one hand, there are some kind of views, and I think this is a fairly kind of common view, a sort of popular view, that wild animals have good lives because they're able to be free and to make their own choices and do their own thing. As long as humans don't interfere with them, their lives are broadly pretty good. I'm calling this the paradise paradigm, right? So I'm going to have the paradise paradigm and the predation paradigm because I wanted things with lots of P's in just so I could trip myself up, right? And I think there are some surveys that kind of support the view that this is a common view, right? The paradise paradigm, but also, for instance, when I talk to my students about zoos, one of the things that they like to say is, well, you know, animals in zoos can't have very good welfare because they're kind of constrained, right? They're not free to do things, whereas if they were in the wild, they'd have good lives. So this does seem to be a fairly widely held view. And then at the other end, and maybe you could think of these as a spectrum, is what I call the predation paradigm, where wild animals are seen primarily within this kind of evolutionary and ecological framework where individuals don't really matter, and what matters is just the kind of evolutionary processes. And because of that, most wild animals live miserable lives. And so their lives, it's all about predation and dying and killing. And this is the model that's become very popular in animal ethics. So at the right-hand side of this slide, I have a screenshot. Yes, I actually learned to do screenshots from the New York Times. So I guess nobody, so I live in the States, so I do read the New York Times periodically, so maybe no one here does, I don't know. But anyway, the New York Times had an article in 2010 by the philosopher Jeff McMahon. And he's now the White's Professor of Moral Philosophy in Oxford, one of the most senior moral philosophy positions in the world. And he wrote this piece called The Meat Eaters, which is essentially about the badness of predation. And you probably can't read it, so I'll just read you a bit of what he says here on this extract. It said, viewed from a distance, the natural world often presents a vista of sublime, majestic placidity, right? So he's saying, oh, here's the paradise paradigm, right? Something like that. Yet beneath the foliage and hidden from the distant eye, a vast, unceasing slaughter rages. Wherever there is animal life, predators are stalking, chasing, capturing, killing, and devouring their prey. Agonized suffering and violent death are ubiquitous and continuous, right? So this is definitely a full-blown version of the predation paradigm. And this has been really taken up in a lot of work in current animal ethics. So I don't suppose many people here spend their time reading this literature, but there's a big literature which argues that many or most wild animal lives are bad. And people talk about this idea of what they call net negative. So they think about welfare in terms of positive and negative experiences and argue that for many or most wild animals, the negative experiences outweigh the positive experiences. So their lives are net negative, and that essentially means they're not worth living. And one of the reasons for that, they argue, is because predation is so prevalent. And another reason for that is the reproductive strategy that's called R-selection. So basically, animals that have lots of offspring, and most of them die before adulthood, and they don't get, lots of parenting. So you've got thousands of baby fish and things like that, and only 2 of them will survive. The rest of them, don't live very long and have bad lives on this model. So this is a very kind of popular view. I would say this is the dominant view at the moment in animal ethics. However, there are some people that have tried to push back. So here's an example of a very recent paper that's saying, well, but maybe neither the paradise model nor the predation paradigm, maybe neither of them is quite right. Maybe actually something that's in the middle is a better idea. So Browning and Veit, in this paper that was published in the journal Biology and Philosophy in 2023, say, look, there is lots of positive experience that many wild animals have, right? There's experience of satiety, social bonding, play, those kinds of things. And also perhaps the idea of predation being this terrible scenario, like Jeff McMahon argues that it is. Maybe it's actually not that bad. Evolutionarily, it would be better if animals were kind of numb at the point that they're being preyed on so that they could try to escape. Whereas if they're undergoing terrible suffering, they're more likely to be unable to escape. So even in evolutionary terms, that wouldn't be a good solution. Right. So that's they argue a whole bunch of things like this. But what everyone agrees, and so one of the reasons for talking about this here, is that there needs to be much more research into wild animal welfare, into living wild animal welfare, so that we actually have a better idea of what's going on in situations like predation and R-selection. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about, there's this disagreement about what to think about wild animal lives. Now I want to say something about what ethicists have to say. So something important here to say is that there's actually a kind of disjunction here between descriptions of what wild animal lives might be like and ethical judgments about what we should do about it. So you might think wild animal lives are really bad, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you should do something about it, right? What you should do about it is going to be a separate level of kind of ethical discussion. And so, and you might think wild animal lives are pretty good, but then you still might think, well, we should help to improve them. So again, it's not clear that you're going to, what you think wild animals are like doesn't determine what you think should happen ethically. So I'm going to look briefly at 3 different kinds of views that you might have when you think about, well, what are wild animal lives like? One view, which is currently the very popular one, is that there are some general duties to help suffering wild animals. So if wild animal lives are bad, or even if they're not that bad, we should still do something to improve them. Then there's a second group of views that basically says, no, we shouldn't intervene in wild animal lives because it threatens ecological values. So those two views are kind of in opposition to one another. And then there are another group of views where people are arguing things like, well, you know, we don't have general duties to help wild animals, but if we've harmed them, if we've done some intervention that's causing them to suffer, then we should do something about it. So I guess there are, I mean, this is an oversimplification, but there are at least these three different kinds of views out there in ethics. So I just want to say something about each of those three views. So the first view and I'm going to say a bit more about this because this is the one that's kind of dominating the field at the moment. What's really interesting about this is that lots of different kinds of ethical theoretical positions have been converging on making this argument. Firstly, they broadly accept the predation paradigm. So most of the people here think wild animal lives are pretty bad. And then they think we ought to do something about it, that we have some kind of duties to do something about it, but they have different reasons for thinking that we should do something about it. So one group of views are basically, so anyone who's taken any philosophy classes or has done any ethics will know that there's a group of views called utilitarian or consequentialist kinds of philosophies. And on those views, you should try and do the things that are going to bring about the best consequences in the world. So you should try to minimize suffering in this case. So you see there's wild animal suffering, it's pretty bad. So you should do something about it. And so these two books here, Making a Stand for Animals and Animal Ethics in the Wild, they're both by well-known animal ethicists, and they're both essentially making this kind of minimizing suffering, so we should intervene sort of argument. They both came out within the last 2 years. Okay, so that's one set of views. Second set of views comes out of the rights tradition. So I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the idea of animal rights. And traditionally, animal rights has been understood as what people call negative rights. So for instance, if you say an animal has a right to life, you mean you shouldn't kill it, right? If you say an animal has a right to freedom, you mean you shouldn't put it in a zoo or something like that. But these people are arguing for what are called positive rights. So if you say an animal has a positive right to life, you mean we should do something to help keep it alive, not that we just shouldn't kill it. And that's exactly the same issue comes up in human rights, right? So the same divide between negative and positive rights in the human case. And this has been extended into the field of animals. So there are people now arguing not just that animals have a negative right not to be killed, but they have a positive right to be helped to stay alive. And of these are 4 book covers of this one by Carl Johansson makes the argument that wild animals have rights to be helped to stay alive. And so we should interfere in order to help them meet their positive rights. So that's a second kind of view. And then the last kind of view is from this book, Justice for Animals by Martha Nussbaum. Some of you here may have read that book. She's a very, very famous public figure, not just in philosophy, but she's recently moved into writing about animal ethics. And she defends a view that's called the capabilities approach, but essentially it's about the idea that everyone should be able to have a flourishing life. And she extends that idea to animals too. So she thinks all sentient animals should be able to have flourishing lives. And then she looks at wild animals, sees the predation paradigm, and thinks wild animals are not having flourishing lives. And we have responsibilities to try to help them to flourish. And so we should help them, what she says, fulfill their capabilities. So I love this quotation. I'd love to set this quotation to my students, get them to write an essay on it. She says, the suffering of vulnerable creatures and their premature deaths matter greatly. It is simply not part of the form of life of these creatures to be eaten by predators. So maybe we could talk about that afterwards, but anyway, that's what she says. So this group of people, all of them, although they're in very different ethical traditions, all think that wild animals have bad lives and we should intervene to help them. We have general duties to help them. And there's a lot of funding coming into organizations that basically have this view at the moment. And just to clarify what kinds of things are being talked about here, I just put this in very quickly. Vaccinations against diseases, So this is a picture of raccoons eating rabies vaccine in the United States. Obviously, people are vaccinating raccoons against rabies because they don't want humans to get rabies, not because they care about raccoons. But the idea, the idea is that you could do that kind of thing. You could use fertility control to reduce populations of wild animals so they don't outstrip their resources. And I think there's a paper about that later on today. You could use genetic modification. So Jeff McMahon, in that paper that I mentioned earlier, argues that if we could, we should try to change predators into herbivores so that they don't eat animals and cause all this suffering. We should try to reduce disease, reduce reproduction. We can use genetic modification to do that. And in general, they argue we should aim for the gradual supplanting of the natural by the just. That's how Nussbaum puts it. Okay, so this is there's some pretty radical views out here, but this is currently, I'd say, the idea that's dominated in animal ethics. Then there's this very different view that's coming out of environmental ethics. So I have a book cover, a book by Holmes Rolston there. He's a very well-known environmental ethicist, and conservation biology, which values some very different kinds of things, right? Their traditional idea is that, when we're thinking about acting in the natural world, we should be concerned about ecosystem services, so the goods that nature can provide to humans, and protecting the intrinsic value of things like ecosystems, species, biodiversity, wildness, all those kinds of things. And that's a very different view from thinking about individual animal welfare. Individual animals here are members of species, members of ecosystems. That's why they matter. And on this view, even if you think wild animals have terrible lives, that doesn't mean that you should intervene in them, right? There's no obligation to do anything. And in fact, you shouldn't intervene in them if that's going to threaten ecological values. And it very likely is going to. For instance, if you're going to start genetically modifying animals to make them more resistant to disease, for instance, then that's going to mean they're not wild anymore, or not in the same sense that they were. So if you think wildness matters, then those kinds of interventions are going to be really problematic. So that's a second kind of view. And then the third kind of view, and here I have to confess that one of these is mine. So I actually wrote a book about this. I'd say my views have shifted a bit since I wrote that. But essentially here the idea is we don't have general duties to help wild animals that are suffering. And indeed, it may be that it's important that they live independent lives. So this book on the right, Zoopolis, here, this is written by Donaldson and Kimlicka, and they argue that wild animals live in sovereign wild communities that we shouldn't normally interfere with because animals shouldn't be left to live their own lives. But where humans have caused suffering through pollution or through habitat destruction or something like that, then we have some kinds of duties potentially to intervene. So it may be that we shouldn't. It's going to depend on the case, but so this is a kind of more nuanced view that's not saying general duties or no, we shouldn't, but yes, we should sometimes if we've been involved in causing the problem in the first place. Just as, if I drive into your car, I have an obligation to compensate you that I don't generally have to other people who've had car accidents, right? So there's something, when you've done something that's caused a problem, you have a special responsibility to do something about it. However, obviously one of the difficulties with views like this is that with climate change and so on, human involvements in the natural world have got more and more complicated. So that suggests that we need kind of more and more interventions. And that's therefore makes this view, more complicated as time goes by. Okay, so three different kinds of views: general duties to help, duties that we shouldn't intervene because of nature, we should protect nature, and ideas that we should help where we've harmed. So three different views out there in ethics. You might, feel more or less sympathetic to one or others of those. So I'm just going to have a couple of slides, just 2 slides, where I say something about some possible ways forward on this. So my view is that we need to develop a kind of pluralist approach that's taking in different elements of these views. So I think, and in a room of people like this, right, you have to say wild animal welfare matters, and I think it does. I also want to argue, and maybe people won't agree with this, that we do have some kinds of special responsibilities to address human-caused welfare problems. So where we've caused problems to wild animals, then that's where we should think seriously about interventions. But also that conservation values are important, that things like ecosystems and species and wildness, we do need to take those things into account when we're making decisions. So we don't, and we don't have to take the view that only welfare matters or only ecosystems matter, but we have to acknowledge that these situations are really complicated and there are lots of different kinds of values at stake. And we're going to have to weigh those values up when we're making decisions. And that we're probably going to need to work on a case-by-case basis where we take lots of different considerations into account when we're thinking about what to do about situations of wild animal suffering. And so here's my very sketchy idea of, where there might be more obligations or more duties to do something and where there might not. So, where there are cases that humans are causally involved, it's essentially our responsibility. There's some kind of intervention that looks as if it's going to be effective. That intervention is not crossways with ecological values and may in fact promote them. And there's obviously significant animal suffering. Those seem like cases where we should certainly think about helping wild animals. And I put wildlife crossings as an example of that, which are increasingly popular in the United States, where roadkill is absolutely massive. So that seems like the kind of thing where you're not going to, it's a kind of win-win thing. But where I think help is going to be more morally problematic system, like our selection, like predation. Interventions are very difficult, and it's hard to know when any kind of intervention there is going to not cause more suffering rather than reduce it. So there are lots of unknown consequences. So effective intervention is difficult. Humans are not the cause. It's a natural thing, and there's a likely conflict with ecological values, which there is in something like this. So if you're intervening in predation. So those are some of my kind of very basic suggestions about how one might think about tackling this. Okay, so those are my 2 slides on that. So lastly, I just have a little case, and this isn't intending to plug a book, but here's a book plug. So we actually talk about this case in a book, Wildlife Ethics. So I authored this with Peter Sando and 3 other people who are not here. But actually, this is the story that's currently in the news. So the headline that I cut out in the top there is actually from a couple of days ago, when there was a story in the Wildlife Society newsletter about Hudson Bay polar bears may not survive climate change. So basically, as I'm sure lots of people here know, climate change is having the effect that ice forms later. Ice melts earlier and forms later in the course of a year. And polar bears catch seals off ice floes. So in the summer, the bears come onto land because there are no ice floes for them to catch seals off. And mostly when they're on land, they're fasting. They have a lot of fat. They fast. They may scavenge for stuff, but essentially they don't eat very much. And for populations in Hudson Bay and some of the more southern populations, the difficulty is that as climate change is warming places up, the ice is forming later and later in the year, and the bears are getting hungrier and hungrier before they can go back out on the ice floes. So the worry is there's going to come a year, maybe not that far off, when these bears are going to starve, because by the time the ice is formed, they've run out of fat. So there's been this discussion amongst polar bear scientists, well, what should we do about this? And one of the proposals was, well, we could feed the bears for that period of time until the ice forms. So this seems like a kind of intervention to animals. They're actually, at least in part, concerned about conserving bear populations, but they're also concerned about bear welfare. And so this seems like a plausible kind of intervention that might kind of reduce bear suffering. It also seems in line with some conservation values. Maybe this is something that we should consider doing. But it's also highly problematic, as I'm sure you can see, that because in order to feed the bears, you have to feed them with something else. And bears normally eat seals. So you would probably have to go and kill seals and then airdrop them to feed the bears. That raises another set of ethical issues if you're doing this for ethical reasons. And also there are the worries about, well, what happens in the long term in a case like this, right? You feed the bears for a couple of weeks, 1 year, and then, well, potentially it's going to end up with having like what the authors called a semi-managed bear park, right, where you're feeding bears all the time, and you're essentially creating a kind of bear zoo. So this is a very complicated case, and I think when we start looking at cases in practice, we see that even in, given the kinds these kinds of ideas I had about when it'd be appropriate to help, we're going to find that in a case like this, you've got even the conservation values coming apart, right? Because you might be doing this to help species, but you're also going to be reducing wildness, because if you're feeding bears, they're less wild. So it's not even a case where you've got animal welfare lining up or opposing conservation values, but you've got conservation values coming apart as well. So in the context of climate change, all of this gets very complicated. So I'm not trying to provide any solutions to this, but we do talk about this case in the book Wildlife Ethics. So if you want to know a bit more about that, you could always get a copy. Okay. All right. So tentative conclusion, right? These photos, this is supposed to be animal hell. I don't really, this is the best I could do. I was Googling animal hell, and then I thought, these are not pictures I want to go for. So I chose that one instead. And animal heaven, right? So so the two kind of controversial issues I've been talking about, that where there are these radically different views are what wild animal welfare is like. Is it mostly hell? Is it mostly heaven? Or is it somewhere in between? And then whatever you think about that, what should you do about it? There are also radically opposing views. Yes, we should intervene to help wild animals generally. No, we shouldn't, or we should sometimes, but it depends. And I've shared some sort of tentative ideas, but I think one of the things that comes out of this whole debate is that animal welfare scientists should really get more involved in these discussions in terms of thinking about what wild animal welfare is like, and in making contributions to what we should, the debate about what we should do about it. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much. And questions?
Thank you very much, and thank you for staying close to the microphone. Some really challenging questions there for, I think, a lot of us who work in animal welfare in other areas where it's very clear that we want to intervene and definitely know that we'd like to try and improve welfare. We can take questions in the room and online. There's roving mics, so if anyone has any questions, I can see Anna is going to start us off.
Please say name and affiliation.
Thank you. I'm Anna Olsson from the Institute for Research and Innovation in Health at University of Porto. I'd like to ask you about the access to, or the lack of information of what it really is like to live in the wild. It strikes me as something that I'm an animal welfare scientist, obviously. I felt it was painful to read Peter Singer when I was a student, because this was so detached from reality. But I see that there's a real problem with wild animal welfare, in that probably no one knows very well what it is like to be a wild animal, or what life, not only from the subjective perspective, but also what life in the wild really is like.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's right. There's not as far as I can tell from what I've been reading, there's not that much research on those questions. And even more difficult, I think, there's not very much research on, very little on what, if you make some kind of intervention, what the effects are on everything around, so if you were to vaccinate. So, okay, so one of the cases that I've been involved with is the idea, so I don't know if any of you know about screw worms. So they're this fly that lays eggs that hatch into horrible little maggots that eat animals alive, that were once really common in the Americas. And there's been using sterilized flies to basically eliminate it so they mate and they don't produce any offspring. So the screw worm, which caused huge amounts of suffering to domesticated and wild animals, has been moved out of North America, and there's now these huge fly releases on the border of Panama. So there's screwworm south of Panama, and there's none north of Panama, right? And so there are questions about, should we use a gene drive to try to eliminate the screwworm, so that there are no screwworms in the Americas at all? So we could just drive the species to extinction genetically. And obviously that raises all kinds of questions, but one of them is, well, if there were no screwworms infections in the broader wild animal population, what would that mean? So we do this very extreme animal suffering caused by screwworms. Screwworms have been spread around Americas by cattle. So humans are partly responsible. So there seem to be reasons for, you know, potentially intervening. But are there animal populations that live on the blowflies? You know, what would happen if we intervened? And people don't know. And it's going to be really difficult to do that kind of research. But yes, that is a real, I agree, that's a problem. And that's something that, you know, there needs to be more research into, especially now that there are all these calls to do something about it. Yeah, great question.
Right. Right. I was just thinking, I mean, for the general public, I think they get a lot of their ideas about wild animals' lives and their welfare from nature documentaries. And I wonder if you can comment a little bit about what views nature documentaries seem to be promoting about their lives and about maybe our ethical responsibilities, and whether you've noticed any cultural changes in that and whether it matters.
That's a great question. I think that's interesting because my sense of a lot of nature documentaries is that they seem to do two different things. I mean, they try and present themselves as being non-intervening on the whole. You know, they're just filming a thing and they're not actually, so they'll show predation and stuff without going in and rescuing anything. So I suppose in that sense, it's kind of non-judgmental. But at the same time, they like to tell kind of narrative stories about particular kinds of animals that I think sets up this kind of mutualism view that you should care for wildlife and how their lives are going and so on. But how realistic those portrayals actually are of what those animals' lives are actually like, I don't know. And so my sense is that they must be having, the wildlife documentaries must be at least partly behind the spread of ideas about mutualism. It must be, and certainly the researchers who are doing that research say wildlife mutualism has partly come from the ways that wildlife documentaries portray the lives of wild animals. But maybe that's more about, so I think it would encourage people to say, try to look after wildlife in their backyard and, you know, hedgehog rescue and that kind of thing, potentially. But no, I mean, beyond that, I don't know. I'm sure there are lots of experts who analyze wildlife documentaries, but I'm not one of those people, so I don't really know more than that. It's an interesting question.
Björn Falkman from University of Copenhagen. I really like your balanced view of both ecological and general duties. I was just interested in those who believe in general duties approach. How would they react to, say, let's kill all the wolves? The wolves are causing lots of pain, or let's kill all the foxes and take care of the overpopulation by some other means. I mean, fertility treatment or genetic modification, whatever you have.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think on the whole, they don't want to be killing things. So I would say that the arguments are generally, and also, I mean, to be fair, I think that they would be concerned about if you were to kill all the wolves or to kill all the predators, you know, that is going to create overpopulation problems amongst the prey animals. And so that could create more suffering down the line. So you'd have to try and work out a way of doing what you were doing, you know, maybe simultaneously. So I think they would want to use fertility control to reduce the number of predators and fertility control to reduce the number of prey. But then the worry is this view ultimately driving to the elimination of all wild animals, right? If you're trying to minimize suffering and their lives are bad, why not just get rid of them altogether? And there's some sort of skeptical view that people call the pavers argument, after, you know, paving over paradise and turning it into a parking lot, right, from the Johnny Watson song. You know, the thought here is you know, basically the only way of eliminating wild animal suffering is by eliminating the wild animals. So that's the kind of extreme version of that view that no one is actually defending. Well, actually, there are a few people there are a couple of people that defend that view, but I think the most of the people who are in this camp would defend something more nuanced and slow and trying to, you know, to reduce wild animal suffering in the ways that were best for animal welfare as they were doing it. But they certainly are highly interventionist and do not think, basically are like mono value. The thing that matters is animal experience, human and animal experiences, and nothing else. We don't think there are other kinds of values. Yeah.
So, could you wait for Mike to
So, hi, I'm Joe Garner from Stanford. For those who don't know me, I tend to be naughty in questions. So, should the asteroid that destroyed the dinosaurs have made the decision to avoid the Earth? The reason I ask this question is that if anybody who knows paleontology, we have a cycle of extinction of large ecosystems roughly every 63 million years. So we're actually 2 million years overdue. And we just happen to be the asteroid this time. So if the Earth has a natural process whereby, and the underlying mechanisms is that ecosystems become too complex, too many specialists to be stable. So if it takes 63 million years for the Earth's ecosystem to become inherently unstable, a small thing will wipe out most of the specialists on the planet, generalists will take over, ecosystems will breed themselves. This is just a cycle, and this time we are the asteroid. Are we actually being crazily, hubristically, humans are the center of the universe, anthropomorphic here? Are a lot of these positions actually based on an idea of human specialness that we might well reject in other animal welfare philosophies? And by the way, I loved your talk. I'm just being mischievous.
I have so many different things to say. I mean, it seems to me like, I'm throwing things around. I've got so much to say. It seems like the asteroid couldn't be about the complex ecosystems, right? I mean, that's not connected. That just came in. So I don't know how, but that seems to be a kind of broadly an ecological worry, right? About loss of species, loss of ecosystems, things like that, not so much a welfare kind of worry. I mean, but the scale of that is huge. And in the same way that you might think, well, you know, humans might go extinct in this extinction, whatever. I mean, I think the issue is that essentially these arguments are like on an everyday level, like what we're doing this year and next year, not what the kind of thousands of years into the future thing looks like. In the same way that we are worried about, you know, human rights in Ukraine, they're worried about animal rights in, you know, the countryside here. You know, it's a kind of now thing rather than looking at it through this lens. I think environmental ethicists are much more inclined to sort of think about the lens of hundreds and hundreds of years. Whereas this is just like an extension of, we're not going to say, well, you know, because humans might become extinct in a couple of hundred years, we shouldn't bother about animal ethics now, right? So I assume this is the same kind of argument that, you know, we should worry about animals now, even if they do go extinct. So I think there are different scales of argument here that seem important. Yeah, I will think some more about it. That's a great question, though. Okay, I'll go away.
Loads of us have probably got more questions, but thank you very much. I'm sure we'll come and chase you to ask more questions in the coffee break. So as is typical with these UFAW meetings, we're going to switch scenario and move to Beth Clark from Newcastle University, who's going to ask, is farm animal welfare a public good?
Oh, what's that done?
Today, we are going to try and address the question, is farm animal welfare a public good? This is a question that myself, Carmen, and Albert have been discussing for a while now. And the presentation today is designed to give you as much as a snapshot as I can within the next 15 minutes. So firstly, I'm going to introduce and define what public goods are, and then in the context of farm animal welfare. I'll then briefly cover 3 separate pieces of work that we've done concerning farm animal welfare as a public good. So first, a thought experiment for looking at the different reasons that markets might fail. And then we'll go through and look at 2 separate surveys that look at some of the different regulatory mechanisms for farm animal welfare. I'll then hopefully come back and try and address the original question. So let's start with a definition. So public good is used within a range of different disciplines, but we're going to focus on the economic definition within this slide. So for something to be considered a public good, it needs to have two properties. So it needs to be considered both non-excludable and non-rival. So non-excludable means that once you've provided something, you can't stop anyone else from benefiting from that particular good or service. And non-rival means that if someone benefits, it doesn't reduce the amount available for others. So this is where, as you can see from the slide, things like lighthouses are considered, but also things like street lighting, for example. One issue we have, though, with public goods is something called the free rider problem. So this is when within a market, someone could decide that they might not want to pay for something because they could still benefit from it. And if everyone decides that they want to do this, benefit without paying, then obviously costs are not going to be recouped from the initial provision of that good or service. So this is when often government intervention is needed to prevent the market from failing. So let's apply this to farm animal welfare. And so farm animal welfare is very often claimed to be a public good. So animals both have a private value in the sense that they provide food products for human consumption, but they also have kind of an ethical or non-use value themselves. So when we think of these two, the non-rival and non-excludable properties of public goods, we can think about higher welfare standards as providing or enhancing consumer safety from safer food products, and then broader public health and environmental health benefits. But we can also think of the benefits to the animals themselves, so to do with things like reduced suffering. If we think of this free rider problem again, though, we know that this also applies to farm animal health and welfare. So, for example, we know from frequent surveys, including the more recent Eurobarometer survey, research shows that a high proportion of people have concerns and would like higher welfare products. But we know that when it comes to sales data, that this concern doesn't always translate into purchases. So this obviously has implications for producers and could lead to market failure. So market failure is when a free market, so one without any government intervention, fails to provide what society really wants or values. So in our case for the presentation today, this is the socially desired level of farm animal welfare. And there are several reasons that this might happen. So there could be a market power or monopoly. There could also be externalities, so indirect effects from the production of the good or services. So pollution's really often mentioned here. We also know that some goods are really socially desirable, but privately unprofitable. So think common vaccination programs would fall into this category. So what do we do when markets fail? So this is a question that Carmen and Professor David Harvey look to try and answer through using a thought experiment. So thinking through all the different causes that markets might fail in relation to higher welfare product. And I'm going to very quickly talk you through their thought experiment. So let's start at the top of the slide here. So say citizens, and when I'm talking about citizens, I'm meaning not just consumers of products, but kind of the wider public base, have voted to improve animal welfare. So there's higher welfare products now in effect. So if consumers buy more of these higher welfare products, that's great. We know that markets are working, as you can see on the right-hand side. But if consumers aren't willing to pay a premium, there's lots of reasons for this. One of the first that you can see on the left-hand side is that they kind of have a cheap talk. So we know that very often people might say something in a survey or a vote, but then not be prepared to follow through on the course or the actions of that vote or what they've said. So in this case, they're not going to follow through and buy higher welfare products. So we know that quite often this is the case. So what are some of the reasons people might also not be willing to pay the premium? So the free rider problem was something that we mentioned within the definition of public goods. And if only a few people decide to free ride, so as you can see on the bottom left-hand side, markets are working because producers should still be able to recoup some of the costs. However, if more people free ride, i.e. don't pay, than the cost of producing the improvements in farm animal welfare, then government intervention is needed to ensure that there's no financial deficit. And I've highlighted this in yellow on the slide, so the yellow text box, because this is where the public good classification comes in and government intervention is needed. But we know from research there's lots of other reasons why people might not necessarily pay a premium for higher welfare products. So two of these are to do with information provision. So either that people don't trust or can find or use labels, or they necessarily don't always know what they mean. Or sometimes people just don't have enough information about animal production. And we know that this is very often the case for certain groups of individuals. So this doesn't necessarily mean government intervention is needed, but it perhaps means we need to think of better ways of communicating information to consumers. So we also need to think about the other factors that people may consider when they're purchasing. So we know that people are very often creatures of habit. They are often quite time poor when they're shopping. So sometimes it's too much effort to check for information. Likewise, we know that people prioritize other information when they're shopping for food, and animal products included here. So particularly at the moment, price is a big factor. Again, this doesn't necessarily mean that the markets aren't working, because markets are designed to provide choice, but obviously this has implications for animal welfare and the provision of animal welfare standards. So we're going to move on to the second piece of work now, and we're going to step back, think back a step and go back to that yellow box and think about, well, if animal welfare could be considered as a public good, then this implies that money from government is needed to support this. And very often this is likely to come from taxpayers. So if taxpayers' money is being used to support public good delivery, well, should the public be asked about their thoughts on this? And this is exactly what myself and colleagues did with a sample of the UK public in the run-up to the new UK agriculture bill being put into force. So we ran an online survey with 521 people, and we had numerous questions included within the survey. So we had 3 surrounding support for public good delivery, so we could triangulate responses. We looked at who people thought, well, they were responsible for ensuring farm animal health and welfare. We looked at the factors they thought were important when shopping for animal products, and then we looked at questions surrounding use of food labels. We then provided a summary of findings, but we were also really interested in how people's responses varied. So was support universal, or was there potentially certain groups or certain segments who may have different preferences for this? So this is what we carried out with the regression and marginal effects analysis. So really interestingly, over 3/4 of people did not know that there was a new Agricultural Act coming into force. As you can see from the 3 circles on the slide here, so these are the 3 questions relating to public good delivery. Over 70% of people agreed that farm animal health and welfare is a public good, and a slightly higher percentage agreed with the use of taxpayers' money in providing this. It was also ranked in the top 3 by over 2/3 of people in a list of 9 public goods provided by DEFRA. When we looked at people's variation in response, perceived responsibility came out as really important here. So this, in order for someone to perceive or support animal health and welfare as a public good, they needed to perceive farmers, the government, animal welfare organisations, quality assurance schemes, and really interestingly, consumers as responsible for farm animal health and welfare. Younger respondents were also less likely to support the use of taxpayers' money compared to older respondents. So older respondents here are those over 65 plus. And this variation in response, again, really nicely leads us in to the last of the 3 pieces of work I'm going to present. So if the use of taxpayers' money is not unanimously preferred by all, it raises the question of what other ways of regulating animal welfare are there, and what are the public preferences for these? And this is something that Albert looked to explore in a US-based survey. So we talked about political means of supporting animal welfare, so through votes and referendums, for example. We know there's market-based ways consumers in particular can support higher animal welfare standards, so from buying higher welfare products. But people can also donate and express their preferences for not-for-profits, so either opposing conventional agricultural production or campaigning for higher standards or alternative means. And these last 2 mechanisms are particularly important when we think about the spectrum of animal product consumption there is out there. So particularly for those who don't consume animal products, so can't use the market-based mechanism, such as vegans. And this is something Albert was really interested in. So in particular, thinking about, well, how does people's support for these different for regulatory mechanisms vary? How does this vary by dietary choice? So does people with different levels of animal consumption have different preferences for different mechanisms? And what are the implications of this going forward? And Albert was able to answer these questions using this approach. So he had 2 steps focusing on 2 questions to elicit information for people. So firstly, he asked people what was their willingness to pay for more ethically produced milk. And for the purpose of the slides and labeling for the graphs on the next slides, we're going to call this willingness to pay OE, so their original willingness to pay. He then went on to a step 2. So he asked people what was their willingness to pay before they felt they were paying too much for what the product was really worth to them. So this is essentially the upper limit or upper bound of their willingness to pay level. And what we can take from these 2 responses is if that someone's original willingness to pay is higher than the upper bound of their willingness to pay. So what they think is too much for what the product is really worth to them, then this indicates some sort of strategic behavior in the sense that they are expressing values higher than the true worth of animal welfare to them. So let's look what Albert found out. So we're just going to focus on 2 regulatory mechanisms here and 2 types of dietary choice, just for the sake of time. But actually, if we start on the left-hand side, or the left-hand graph, shall I say, you can see here that people's original willingness to pay, both mechanisms, is lower than the upper bound, so the upper limit of what the farm animal health and welfare is really worth to them, which makes sense. So omnivores are willing to pay a value within the kind of limits or bounds of what they think farm animal welfare means to them. If we look at vegans, on the other hand, we can see the opposite is the case. So their original willingness to pay is higher than what farm animal health and welfare means to them. So we can see that they are expressing some sort of strategic behavior. So this could be the over-signaling of their values. It could be a possible desire to impose an additional cost on those that consume animal products. And it could also mean that they attach high values to farm animal welfare and want higher farm animal welfare standards, irrespective of the cost implications. So let's pull all of this together and go back to our original question. Is farm animal welfare a public good? And I'm going to tell you yes, but, and in fact, I'm going to leave you with 4 more questions here that you can see on the slide. So firstly, who bears the cost? So if animal welfare standards are to be improved, which there really does seem to be support for, then who pays for this? We know the market might not be ready, in the sense that consumers might not want to pay or might not be willing to pay for higher welfare standards, which gives rise to the question of how are the kind of distribution of these costs therefore put about? We also know from Carmen's thought experiment that more communication and transparency is needed. And thinking about how we go and do this is a really interesting question. So do we need to rethink food labels? Do we need to think more broadly about education surrounding farming and food production? It's also worth thinking about in relation to socially acceptable standards and the industry's social license to operate and the level of transparency and accountability to the wider public that they have here. And if we're thinking more broadly along these lines, this is also really important for the concept of food democracy. So thinking about people being aware of what's happening with their food system, what are the different alternatives that are available, and how they can be involved within this. This really nicely also leads us into who should be responsible. So there are a range of different stakeholders in this space that we know of, including consumers themselves. And we know that if consumers don't see themselves as responsible, either for market-based solutions or more political mechanisms, then they're unlikely to support this. So we need to think about how we can encourage people to enact their responsibility in lots of different ways. And then lastly, what is good animal welfare? So one of the key things that we've been asking is all of this is that if markets fail, then they're not providing the socially optimal or socially desired level of animal welfare. But do we actually know what this is? And whose perspective should we be taking into account on this, given that what the public might want might not always be best for the animal? So that's a kind of whistle-stop introduction to what we've been talking about. All 3 papers are now published, so if you want to find out more about each one, please either click on the links or visit the QR codes, and thank you for listening.
Any other questions? Just while we wait for the microphone to get there, I might use a chair's privilege one and say, is there perhaps a role for animal welfare scientists in trying to make high welfare cheaper, that we should be looking for solutions that we can actually get consumers to pay for?
That's a good question. Is that something that's feasible for Malachi?
I defer to cleverer people in the room.
It could be a way, and I guess especially with industry, they're always looking for production efficiency. But then I think in terms of actually delivering higher welfare, there's research that's come out of France in particular recently that's shown the true cost of higher welfare products is considerably more expensive. So I think it's going to take some job to do.
I think someone's got a microphone somewhere.
Hello. Thank you, Sarah Duse from the University of Hohenheim. So we're agricultural economists. And I remember a concept from John McEnany, which is almost 20 years old, where he proposes that animal welfare is first a public good, but as the level of animal welfare increases, it becomes a merit good and then a private good. So because when animals are treated extremely badly, many people care about it, but as animal welfare increases, less people will care and it becomes a private good. So in your survey, did you ask about specific levels of animal welfare that the public might conceive as public goods?
So in Albert's survey, he provided a specific example of what he meant by more ethically produced milk. So it was having calves kept with their mothers for longer periods of time. Within our UK-based survey, it was just a more generic, should this be considered as a public good? So supported through the use of taxpayers' money.
That one last question from the person with the mic up there.
Thanks for the presentation, Beth. Jim Wilshire from the UK. I'm just curious about the last slide regarding the vegans' expression of a willingness to pay higher than the true worth of animal welfare to them. That wasn't your work, that was the US work, is that right? Yeah. Right. But they're not actually paying anything for it.
No. And
okay, it's a slight flaw, isn't it, there?
Yeah, so again, I think this comes back to that value signaling point, and that potentially they're wanting people to pay a lot more for products to maybe show that they're paying for the animal's true worth. It's something we're really keen to replicate in the UK to see if it carries across, because out of all 4 all of the dietary categories shown, they were the only group where that willingness to pay was that high, and the initial willingness to pay was higher than the higher limit of their willingness to pay. So we're really interested to see if that carries across into different contexts.
I think it would be interesting in the UK, wouldn't it? And particularly as well, the cost of living, et cetera, where this society values this in terms of relative to other things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beth. So I will just introduce the next talk while Steve tries to strangle me with a mouse. So this is a local talk from Gabriela Morello here in Porto. And I thought I might just mention at that stage, in case you're thinking that there's any local bias, that when we select these talks for this meeting, we review all the abstracts completely blind and select the most interesting ones. So we never know who we're going to have talking. So I promise you that this is purely coincidental that we've got a local Porto talk as the next one. And Gabriela is going to be talking about younger dams without older litters in the cage, increases mouse pre-weaning survival.
All right. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for being here and patient. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about mouse pre-weaning mortality. Right. I can use this. Okay, it's fine. It's still not working.
Sorry. It's because he's clicked on the wrong thing. Try that now. Yeah.
Okay, there you go. Okay, so first of all, why talk about pre-weaning mortality of mice? What we've been seeing the past couple of decades, it's a lot of reports from the literature of very variable mortality rates and also very high Those numbers, 30%, 40%, and even more percent pre-weaning mortality are not accepted for any other species that we use, for example, food consumption. And that's what we've been seeing, particularly to the strain of 657 Black 6J, which is one of the most used strains for biomedical research. So this study focused on this strain. Before talking about jumping into the mortality issue, just a little bit about mouse breeding. We're going to talk about mortality in the context of mouse breeding. Usually, research facilities, they can have their own breeding facility where they raise and produce their mice that they are going to use for biomedical research. And sometimes they can purchase from commercial breeding facility. This is a picture of a pretty typical breeding room. There are mouse racks. Each slots are going to have one cage, and each cage are going to have adult mice that are allowed to keep breeding uninterrupted. This is a picture of a Black 6 dam and her offspring. And what I want you to notice is that they are born very tiny, delicate, nearly deaf and blind with very little mobility. So they are very delicate. In nature, they usually live in groups of one male for multiple females, and the females, they usually share nests. That's referred as communal nesting, and they help each other to raise their offspring. So this seems to help them to their pups to survive until weaning. And thinking about that, housing configurations inside breeding facilities, sometimes they do house a male with multiple females. Specifically for the trio housing, there are 2 females for a male and they keep breeding uninterruptedly. But also there is the pair housing, which is 1 female for a male, which is also very common. So we focus our study in these 2 type of configurations. Sometimes you're going to see the adults and 1 litter, but sometimes you're going to see the adults and a couple of litters, what we are calling litter overlap. For trios, this is kind of straightforward why this happened. The second female will give birth as well, and you're going to see 2 litters. Sometimes they're synchronized, sometimes they are not. There is an age gap, but that also happens for the pair housed mice, because sometimes the postpartum estrus and the gestation length is usually around 18 days for this strain, and pups get weaned at about 21 days of age, and this is when they are able to eat solid food and reach the hopper that has the food. And why am I introducing the housing schemes and the litter overlap? Because a few years ago, we were studying parental behavior of single house dams and trio house dams. And we realized that we had to divide our trio house into 2 groups, actually. The ones that had only 1 litter and the ones that had litter overlap. And the reason for that is because having 2 litters in the cage, the output was very different, and the mortality, the total litter loss, more than doubled, and the average pre-weaning mortality nearly doubled. So litter overlap seems to be a relevant issue to mortality of mice raised for biomedical research. We confirmed that pattern by mining historical data of over 34,000 liters, but also we wanted to see in another breeding facility in a larger study if we got the same results, and also how these social factors, the litter overlap, interacted with the cage microenvironment to affect pup mortality, those very delicate pups. So this was the focus of our study. So what we did, we placed loggers in our cages in the breeding facility, in our own breeding facility. The temperature and light intensity loggers, they were inside the cage near the lid where the mice couldn't reach. and also accelerometers outside the cage, so we could estimate the vibration later. We also took into account macro environment factors such as season, month of birth, weekday, year, and breeding room. And we counted pups we checked on the cage every day, and we counted pups every day to get an accurate picture of mortality. We did it twice a day for a total of 509 liters, 3,380 pups over the course of 2 years of experiment. Jumping to the results, I want first to show you what was going on in the cage in terms of microenvironment. Starting with the temperature, if we look at the average, it seems nice because pretty often the target of the room temperature is between 21 and 22 Celsius. But if we take a look on what inside the cage looked like over the course of the entire 24 hours post-birth, you can see that most of the litters, they experienced temperatures of 21 to 23, but 1/3 of them also experienced higher temperatures above 23 and above, and 1/3 of them experienced temperatures that were lower than 21 Celsius, and this is already code for the adults. So just a reminder that the pups are very delicate, so this is a big issue. The range was from 18.8 to 24.7. About temperature variability, most of the litters, they experienced at least half of a degree of variation within their first day of life. More than half of them experienced 1 degree of variation in this first day of life. And more than 1/3 of them, 1.5 degrees and above. So there was a lot of variation. There is a lot of information in this slide, but I just want to point out here that all the other microenvironment parameters, they also had variation inside the cage, such as the light. We had a motion sensor in front of the rack. So for the first day of each litter, we retrieved how many times a human passed by in front of the cage. We also estimated that. Vibration, here is acceleration, and nest score also varied. A nest score of 0 would be an undisturbed nest. We wanted to see how the nests were built. And a nest score of 5, it's a pretty closed dome-shaped nest. Now let's see how all of these, and plus the social factor, affected pup mortality. Most of the pup deaths happened within the first 24 to 48 hours postpartum, which was expected from what we've been learning. Litter overlap, again, found the same pattern, was more than 3 times the mortality of the groups that had no overlap. So it is a big issue that we have to study a little bit more. Controlling for the other factors, we found an effect of dam age. As the dams were older by the time that they gave birth, the probability of pups, the new pups dying, increased, especially for the overlapped group. This is the size of the new pups. The small litters and big litters, they also increased the probability that the pups would die for the overlapped group. And for the non-overlapped group, small litters seems to be an issue. And when we took a look on the data just for the overlapped litters, we could see that the bigger the older pups, the bigger the older litter was in terms of number of pups, and the older that they were, probability of death also increased. Now imagine if we get that combination, an older dam with numerous older pups in the cage, with close to weaning, that's the recipe of a high mortality of the new pups. Now, finally, our model taking into account the microenvironment data. This is a descriptive model. It's a decision tree. It looks like an upside down tree. The the top notes, the top attributes are usually the most important ones because they divide the entire data set. And they agree with our other models in that the social factors, dam age, litter overlap, litter size, are the most important factors for pup overlap. And what I want you to take from this picture is that we want to be on the green side because that means higher survivability. And if we go to the green side with no overlap, so dams are younger than 343 days. That's the threshold that the model created. There is no overlap. But if the litter is small, as long as we have a darker environment, we can alleviate a little bit the mortality that we would have if there was some light inside the cage. If we go to the riskier side, where there is more pink, where there is litter overlap, the age of the other pups is older than 6 days, and then they are numerous, more than 4 pups, and then the maximum temperature is not that warm. There is some temperature variation, and the minimum temperature in the cage is less than 21, then NAS score appears to be relevant in that NAS scores higher than 3.75, improved survivability. And this makes sense, right? In such a risky and disturbed situation, a good NAS will protect the pups. Now, all of our microenvironment attributes, they were either end nodes or they were near end nodes, which means they represent much less of the data. But this may be because we were not imposing any extreme temperatures or light intensity. All of these was what we got in a breeding room, that it's a model breeding room. It has temperature control. And as you can see, there is still variation, and this still matters. So for conclusions, litter overlap is extremely relevant for pup mortality. We need to study that more. And so is dam age, age and number of older pups in the cage, and a proper microenvironment seems to be alleviating a little bit of these social risks. The results of this work are going to be out soon in Communications Biology, still this year. So you can find more details about it. This was what I had for today. So thank you for being here. This is our team. This is our Vital Pup website and my contact if you need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. Do we have any questions out there? I think I saw one somewhere. Where am I looking? We can get a microphone across. It's Joe with a nice question this time, or is it? Oh, it's Brianna. That's all right.
Thanks, Gabby. Brianna Gaskell, Novartis. So a couple quick clarification questions. What kind of nesting material did they have?
These ones, they had 2 paper towers. They were given 2 paper towels, and they would build from scratch.
Okay. Second question, you had some litter sizes up to 20. That seems fairly outrageous.
No, it's because sometimes what we have in overlapped litters is more than 2 litters.
Okay,
that
gotcha.
can happen because, especially in trios,
Mhm.
the same female, sometimes she didn't wean her first litter, she gives birth, and the second female also gives birth, and then you end up having. So in our model, we had situations of pups being up to 20-something, 20-something pups. We also had situations, one situation in which we had pups that were as old as 30 days of age in one of the cages. Yes, it happened. I don't know why, but yes, we did.
Okay.
Please, mute yourself, guy. Please mute yourself.
Hi everyone, this is Carly from U4. Can everyone who's attended online please mute their microphones, please? Thank you.
Go ahead with your question. Thanks.
All right, thank you. I'm Hayola Oluyemi from Nigeria. And with my experience with raising other animal and mouse, and I noticed that while raising dam and pups, as after the first litter, as the dam give birth to more, it tends to the survival of the pups increase. But in your report, you're saying that as the dam are getting older, there is probability for increased mortality. I want to know the duration of time you use to get to this conclusion. Also, I would like to know if handling of this dam and pups were put into consideration, because human handling also affects the survivability of pups, and also it has been found that some dams also eat these pups. Are you able to differentiate between mortality due to handling and eating of the pups, and just natural death or accidental death by other pups or mature pups in the cages? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for this question. I'll answer the last one because I forgot the first one, so bear with me, please. We've been looking at causes of mortality, and for this strain, in our studies with cameras on the pups, we've been seeing that infanticide, which is the actively killing of the mothers, killing of the pups by the mothers, is very, very rare. So what happens is usually the mother eats the pup cadavers. They are born, and shortly after they die, and then the mothers consume the pup cadavers. Or we have also a study of, it's from Sarah Kappas, and she's looking at post-mortem analysis. And what she's been finding is that most of them are still born. And many of them that actually breath after birth, they had no milk in their stomach, and sometimes they had air bubbles. So we don't know if they try to suckle and have some milk and were not able and were weak and died. But the fact is they first die, and then the dams consume their cadavers. So we have no evidence for infanticide. In this specific study, we didn't have any cameras, so we considered the pups to be dead every time we went there and found a pup cadaver or a pup was missing. That's what we did. So our dead pups include the missing and the dead pups.
We have a question online from Laura Webb. Is there any advantage to having two females together? And if yes, what are these advantages?
Yes, there is evidence on the literature that the two females together, they nurse their litters indiscriminately, so they help each other. They perform maternal behavior such as pup retrieval. They help to keep the pups in the protected environment of the nest, and also they give some time for each other to leave the nest and have some food and do whatever maintenance behavior they need to, and returning to the nest so that the other dam can go and do the same. So there are advantages. And we did another study, which we'll be presenting in ISAE on Thursday, that we saw that if the litters are synchronized, the actually output of weanings, number of pups weaned per litter is actually good. So we are starting to see in the laboratory some of those advantages as well. So it seems that age gap in litter overlap is the real problem.
Do we have one more quick one in the room, or are we? Okay, we're all
Okay. Hello.
Okay. Okay. Well, in that case, thank you very much, Gabriela. So we'll move on to our last talk of this session, and we're going to keep it diverse by moving on to fish. I'd like to welcome Angela Bergschmidt from Germany, who's going to talk about monitoring animal welfare in aquaculture.
So hello and welcome from my side. I hope as being the last presenter, you still bear with me. And yeah, it's not only about fish, but it's about farmed animals in general, but we include also fish. So I'm trying to see if I can work with the technique. Okay, fine. So first of all, I've been coordinating this project. So I will presenting to you results from a project where really a lot of people collaborated, and you see a picture where we all very happily have presented the final results at the end of the project last year. So I will shortly present you some background information which led to the project, and I will go to the project term, aim of the project, and work packages. And I will focus more on the recommendations for the implementation of an animal welfare monitoring system. And it was a German project, so most of the results will be about Germany, but I will also a little bit come into what is in it for other countries. So we really have a lot of farmed animals in the European Union. In 2021, we had 76 million cattle, 142 million pigs, 60 million sheep, 11 million goats, and billions of poultry. And we are missing information on the fish. But we also have a lot of carp and trout, which we have also included in the projects. And what is problem from my point of view and point of view of many people is that we have a lot of statistics on production. We have quantities of meat, milk, eggs produced. And there, I mean, representative data. So it's not something that some scientists collected on some sample, but we have this as a regular statistics, and they are also published, but we don't have this kind of information on animal welfare indicators. And as a consequence, we don't know really where we stand in terms of many animal welfare indicators. We don't know the status quo. We don't know the development. And we also have a problem in designing relevant animal welfare strategies. And it also makes it quite difficult to evaluate the effectiveness of existing animal welfare legislation and support measures. And by support measures, I mean the support measures like agricultural policy measures from the European Union, like Common Agricultural Policy. So this was sort of the rationale behind the project on National Animal Welfare Monitoring, which is a German project. And you shortly see the institutions involved in this project. And what we did is we have about one team which was in charge for every animal species that we worked in the project. And we also have the German National Statistical Office, which was involved and which sort of consulted on any subject which had to do with statistics. And the project term was from 2018 to 2023. So last summer we concluded the project, and it was supported by our Federal Ministry for Agriculture. I will not go into the animal welfare definitions here because I think you all know it. I just wanted to say that sometimes you hear animal health and animal welfare. When I'm talking about animal welfare, animal health is always included. And later when I come to the selection of indicators, the definitions we used will still come into some importance. So the aim of the project was to prepare something that would then later be implemented by politics. So we did not sort of implement animal welfare monitoring, but we made the preparational steps. And we wanted to do that in a comprehensive way. So we would like to include husbandry, transport, and slaughter. And we wanted to do that for all important important animal species in Germany, which is cattle, pigs, chicken, turkey, sheep, goats. And then also for the two sort of aquaculture species which are quite common in Germany, which is rainbow trout and common carp. So what we did was first, like any project, we carried out a literature analysis, but we also published this as an online resource. So whenever you would like to know all the indicators which we have found in the literature, these are published in online, unfortunately only in German, but translators are already quite good in working with that. Then we identified expectations for an animal welfare monitoring. We interviewed quite a lot of stakeholders, and we also had a large online survey. And then we selected indicators which sort of can be the starting point of such an animal welfare monitoring. We assessed the suitability of the existing data and prepared sort of for surveys to be carried out for the collection of missing data, and we formulated recommendations. And one thing I forgot to say at the beginning is that when I talk about monitoring, what we mean is really the monitoring, like it has the same form like of a statistic. So it's not a monitoring which serves the farmer to improve his management by collecting data on animal welfare indicators on his farm, but it's a data source which sort of is there to inform politics, to inform society, and which sort of is collected at the different levels, like on the farm, at the slaughterhouse and so on, but sort of needs to be representative, so to really be able to give a picture. And I'm going to go a little bit into more detail for the selection of indicators and also with respect to the recommendations. So we had quite a long work on
we tried every way
It's my fault.
That sounds good. Okay, so that was really scary. So we established some criteria for the indicator selection. For example, we decided not to use any measurement because we think that it's not easily done. It's not like a scientific research project, but we need to sort of refrain from invasive measurements of animal welfare in this context. The relevance and the frequency of an animal welfare problem was sort of taken into account. This kind of monitoring will not be able to measure problems in animal welfare which occur, for example, to 0.01% of the population, because it will just not be, because we don't have sort of, we only have a sample of farms and slaughterhouses which will be assessed. So there's no good way of finding out very specific, rarely occurring animal welfare problems. One issue was practicability. So the indicators need to be really be able to assess in a rather short time on farm, in the slaughterhouse. And we fixed an amount of like 4 hours in which a whole set of indicators which needs to be assessed on site would have to be able to be carried out. And then we also said that the final set should include all animal welfare dimensions or all freedoms. So we would want our animal welfare monitoring not to concentrate solely on animal health or solely on behavioral aspects of animal welfare. And the procedures was that we had first a scientific pre-selection, then we had a multi-stakeholder process with many different aspects, and then we had a trial data collection on the different places where those indicators are relevant. So I will very shortly present some of the indicators, and I've only selected indicators here which are sort of covering all, which are common for all animal species. We also have indicators which are very specific and which are like only for laying hens or so, and I'm not going into them, but just that you get an overview of the kind of indicators. And nothing of this is new because the indicators have been taken from literature, they have been tested, they have been proven valid. So there's there has not been any new invention of indicators for most animal species. For aquaculture, this was a little bit different because, in fact, for fish, there's really a lack of literature, a lack of research which has been done on animal welfare indicators so far. So the animal welfare team and the fish team really had to do quite a lot of work also in development of indicators. So shortly come to the recommendations. One thing which is really important is that an animal welfare monitoring system sort of is not, you cannot just sort of create it. You need a legal basis to do so, because if you visit farms, if you go to slaughterhouses, you ask for access, you ask them to look at the animals. This is not something which is sort of done on a you ask and you get basis, but you really need the right to do this. Then you also need institutions which are able and which have the capability of doing this kind of work. You need funds because it does not come without costs. And you need to enable the use of existing data. You need to implement a collection of missing data. And at the end, the data needs to be published. And I will go a little bit more into detail with respect to the last points I've mentioned. So enable the use of existing data in each of our countries. We do have some data on animal welfare. We have some statistics, for example, on housing systems. We have official cattle registry data, at least in the European Union, where some information like mortality is recorded. We often have milk control data. I don't know how this in your countries. In Germany, it's not really a valid information source for milk from goats, but it's only for dairy milk. But there it's quite valuable for indicators, for example, like mastitis, or also for word missing, sorry. Then we have quality control data, where the post-mortem inspection, which is carried out normally for human health reasons, but which also contains valuable information on animal health, is recorded. And we have, for example, for transport, the trade control and export system, which provides information, for example, for third country exports for live animal transports. And the problem is that we have all this data, but with the exception of statistical data, we cannot access any of this for animal welfare, at least not in Germany. Maybe this is different in some other countries, but in Germany, you always have a strict definition on what the data is collected for, and there's no other way to use it. So all this data is there, and it's not possible to use it. And this is obviously annoying, and this has to be, you need a law sort of to change this, otherwise it just stays like that. But then we also have the problem that this data I've showed you only covers a very small amount of the indicators which are relevant for animal welfare. So for 85% of the selected indicators, and it's not only the indicators that we selected, but it's a general problem. Even if other people would select indicators, most of the data is not available yet, and it needs to be collected. And that especially is relevant for animal species like the fish, but also for the poultry, the goats and the sheep, where there is really no data source yet. And what we recommend for data collection is, on one side, written surveys, because some of the information we need can be collected from the farmers or from the slaughtering plant people. For example, what kind of anesthesia they are using. It's something that they can answer and that they would answer. There's not really risk in asking them that. But you also need audits, for example, to assess lameness. That's something, or integument alterations or body condition scores. We calculated with samples of about 10% of our farms and got to kind of acceptable error rates. And that would be carried out for all kinds of farms, so all the agricultural farms, but also the fish farms, at control posts and collection centers, at slaughterhouses, and to the animals delivered to rendering plants, because we also have some indicators which have to do with euthanasia carried out in the right way, which can only be collected at rendering plants. Need to be carried out by established, or they can be carried out by established institutions, so you don't need to establish a whole new world of auditors. And in Germany, for example, it can be the certification inspections body. So these are institutions which are, for example, carrying out control for ecological farming. And we suggest that this is to be carried out in 4-year intervals, because you cannot have every year a substantial change in all those indicators. Yeah, the results need to be presented, but in fact, we chose quite a lot of indicators, and they don't need to be presented for each and every indicator, because otherwise that would maybe be a little bit too much for all the people who are interested in animal welfare. But we think there should be a database sort of where all the information is and can also be analyzed by research. But presented, there would be a selection of indicators which are interesting for, or where we also have seen changes. And we advise at the moment not to use threshold values or goal, but just to present where we are, because I think this is the start for the discussion also to where we want to be. And we suggest to present developments over time, but also to present how the best 25% of farms stand with respect to the indicators, because that's something that is achievable for other farms. So that might be interesting also when we're discussing about goals. I come to my last slide. So what's in it for other countries? I've sort of focused a little bit more on the EU context. I know that there are also people from other states here. I'm not really well informed, so please excuse that I've not really included you into my considerations here. But with respect to the EU, we have a high interest of society for animal welfare. We have missing information on animal welfare, and this is sort of all over the EU. We don't have one country which really has already which sort of stands out in having all this information that we would like to have. We think that many of the procedures we utilized in our project can be implemented at the EU level or also in other EU member states, like the indicator selection process, for example, but also with respect to the recommendations, the thing that you need legal provision to do this kind of exercise is the same all over the EU and also in the member states. And finally, it would provide or it would speed up the process if the European Union would itself sort of take a more leading role into the process and sort of would guarantee collective action if the EU would sort of promote this kind of exercise. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We've got time for a couple of quick questions. If there's any in the room, I can see Peter's hand up there.
Thank you for a very nice talk. We had a similar set of projects in Denmark, but we ran into the trouble that we couldn't force farmers to give us access to their farms. To do it properly, you need to do a random selection of farms, because if you only select those farms that already volunteer, you get a skewed sample. So have you any solution to that problem in Germany? Because it seems that most countries, farmers are free to decide whether they want to be part of these things. And without that, then there will never be a valid welfare monitoring if we cannot do random sampling of the farms.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. This is why we need a legal basis. I mean, that's sort of the main problem about all our scientific studies, is that we always are reliant on the farms or the slaughterhouses, the rendering plants, which are willing to cooperate. So we have a skewed sample. But for all the other statistical data that we are collecting, they are not voluntary. So the farmer receives a document by our statistical office, and it's a legal requirement to participate, and it's not something which is voluntary. And we just don't see why an animal welfare monitoring should work in any other way, but in this way. And that then would mean that we can have a sample procedure, and we can then just have a representative sample.
You're not there yet.
No, we are still waiting for a decisive minister who's willing to carry out something like this. For the moment, our ministry is engaged in other important matters.
see Joe's hand up there in the middle. So we'll take that as the last question, if that's okay.
Hi, Joe Garner, Stanford. I won't keep people from coffee. It's just a really short comment. Actually connecting to the talks we've had this morning. So in the US, we have a number of different programs. Probably the most prominent one is the American Humane Association's Free Farm Food Program. And so farms can volunteer to meet these higher welfare standards. And unbelievably, actually, McDonald's is really important in this movement in the US. And so that then gives an external stamp of approval that certain requirements have been met, and that increases the sale price of those products. And so I think that matches very nicely with the earlier talk that we had, where actually in the US, we do have a model for how to make this happen, but it does involve people basically deciding that they're going to spend more money producing each animal, but then they're going to be able to sell that product at a much higher price, and it's going to be guaranteed by these external third-party programs. So just an example of a model where things work and tie to the talks together. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this was just a remark for that was not a remark to my presentation, or did I miss something?
I think my point was the EU, frankly, tend to have top-down legal implementation, whereas in the US, we don't. In the US, sorry, I'm not shouting something out. In the US, there's this attitude of you have to get stakeholders to buy in. So that's stakeholders, farmers, buy into external third-party audit.
No, but I would like to mention something then. What you have is also a voluntary databases for people who are willing to improve animal welfare. And this is not what we are talking about here. What we are talking about is a lack of information on the general status quo of animal welfare. So also American farms, which are not really maybe having the best management, would you know how many lame cows you have? Would you know how the mortality is on your pig farms? Would you be able to say things have improved or things have gotten worse? And with respect to this or this indicator, or is it also data that is missing in the US? Because it's not something that you can sort of create on a voluntary basis. I mean, it's like, it's a statistic. You need it from all the people, or from a sample which is representative for all the people.
Thank you very much. So thank you, everyone. That's the end of our first session. Because we're running a little bit behind, we'll get coffee till 11:55. So if you come back at 11:55, coffee is out there in the poster room and in the room opposite as well.